In the hazy fog of history, some names echo like a curse, an unhealing scar on the memory of humanity, and no name evokes the image of total annihilation, of hell on earth, more vividly than Stalingrad. Imagine a city where the life expectancy of a new soldier was, on average, just 24 hours. Picture a battlefield where, after the fighting ceased, over 2 million souls were counted among the dead, soldiers and civilians alike, a number that defies comprehension. Gaze upon the black and white photographs of a once vibrant metropolis, now a desolate wasteland of rubble, a skeleton of concrete and twisted steel, where 99% of the buildings had been leveled. This is not a scene from a horror film. This was the reality of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942-1943. The question echoes through the decades. What transformed a city on the banks of the Volga River into the single largest slaughterhouse in the history of warfare? Why were millions of people willing to fight and die for every brick, every stairwell in this place? And how, from within this smoldering ruin, did a decisive turning point of the entire Second World War take shape? The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military clash. It was the ultimate test of human will, a confrontation of ideologies, a crucible in which the fate of the world hung precariously in the balance, suspended between ice and fire. To understand the essence of this battle, we must rewind to the blazing summer of 1942 and answer the most fundamental question: why Stalingrad? On the strategic maps of Nazi Germany, Stalingrad was not initially the ultimate prize. The plan for the summer of 1942, codenamed Fall Blau or Case Blue, had a far more ambitious target: the oil fields of the Caucasus. Hitler understood that for Germany's war machine to keep running, it needed oil, vast quantities of it. Seizing the Caucasus would provide an endless supply of fuel for German panzers and planes while simultaneously strangling the Soviet war economy, which was heavily dependent on oil from this region. Stalingrad, a long city stretched along the western bank of the Volga, was at first seen as a secondary objective, a flank guard to protect the main armored thrust driving south. But then, an element of irrationality crept into the cold military calculations: the city's name, Stalingrad, city of Stalin. For Adolf Hitler, this name carried immense symbolic weight. To capture the city named his archenemy would be a devastating blow to Russian morale and a priceless propaganda victory for the Third Reich. It would be a personal humiliation for Joseph Stalin himself. Gradually, the secondary strategic objective became clouded by personal obsession and ideology. Hitler became fixated on Stalingrad, diverting elite panzer divisions from the Caucasus front towards the city, a decision that would later prove to be a fatal mistake. For Stalin, the logic was mirrored. To lose the city that bore his name was unthinkable. It would be an admission of failure not just militarily, but spiritually. He issued Order No. 227, famous for its ruthless slogan, "En Aisha Nazad," not a step back. Anyone who retreated without orders was to be shot on sight. This order turned the soldiers of the Red Army into defenders with no option but to fight to the death. Stalingrad became a line in the sand, a symbol of the resistance of the entire Soviet Union. Beyond the symbolism, Stalingrad's geography was also critically important. Situated on the Volga River, the city was an industrial hub and a vital transport link. The Volga was like an aorta, carrying oil from the Caucasus and grain from the south to feed the armies and industrial cities of the north. To sever this artery at Stalingrad would paralyze the Soviet Union, effectively cutting the country in two. Thus, Stalingrad, once a flank guard, became a funnel, drawing in the mightiest armies, the greatest resources, and the very prestige of two dictators. The battle was destined to become an uncompromising showdown where failure was not an option for either side. When the German Sixth Army, one of the Wehrmacht's most seasoned and battle-hardened units, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, approached the city in late August, they were supremely confident. The German Luftwaffe had paved the way with a cataclysmic bombing campaign. Thousands of tons of explosives rained down, turning Stalingrad into a sea of fire. Over 40,000 civilians were killed in the first week alone. The city was essentially erased. The Germans believed taking the resulting rubble would be a simple matter of mopping up. They were wrong. The very destruction they had wrought had inadvertently created the perfect defensive terrain. This rubble of buildings, the skeletal remains of factories, and the labyrinth and sewer systems turned the city into a deadly maze. This was a place where the German blitzkrieg lightning war, which relied on the mobility of tanks and coordinated air power over open terrain, became utterly useless. Tanks were channeled into narrow streets, becoming easy prey for Soviet anti-tank teams hiding in cellars. Artillery and air support could not be used effectively because the opposing forces were too close to each other. A new, more primitive and brutal form of warfare was born. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Fighting was no longer conducted on clear fronts, but in individual rooms, basements, and street corners. The line between the two sides was sometimes just a single wall. Soviet soldiers would be fighting for one floor of an apartment building, while Germans held the floor above or below. They burrowed through walls to launch surprise attacks. They fought in the darkness of the sewer systems and in the cramped corridors of factories. Grenades, bayonets, and crude melee weapons became the primary tools. General Vasily Zhukov, the commander of the Soviet 62nd Army defending the city, implemented a tactic he called hugging the enemy. He ordered his troops to stay as close to the German lines as possible, sometimes only a few meters away. This nullified the German advantage in air and artillery power, as any airstrike or barrage risked hitting their own men. It turned the battle into a series of brutal, personal duels. Previously anonymous landmarks became legends written in blood. The Mamayev Kurgan, a strategic hill overlooking the city, changed hands no fewer than 8 times. After the battle, the soil on the hill was so churned by ceaseless bombardment that between 500 and 1,250 pieces of metal were found per square meter. The following spring, grass failed to grow on its scorched slopes. The Red October Steel Factory, the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory, and the Barakati Gun Factory became vast fortresses, their workshops turned into killing fields. Workers continued to repair tanks in one part of a factory while ferocious battles raged in the next. Perhaps no symbol of the tenacious Soviet resistance is more potent than Pavlov's house. It was an ordinary 4-story apartment building overlooking a key square. A small platoon led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov captured and fortified it. With only about 24 men, they held this single building for nearly 2 months against relentless German tank and infantry assaults. They turned it into a maze of connecting trenches, machine gun nests, and mortar positions. On German field maps, this building was marked as a fortress. General Zhukov would later joke wryly that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they did taking Paris. The battle also gave rise to a new kind of hero, the sniper. In the urban warfare environment, where every window could conceal death, snipers became terrifying predators. The most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, credited with over 200 German kills. The story of his legendary duel with the German master sniper, Major Erwin Knig, became part of Stalingrad's folklore, a testament to the individual, one-on-one war being waged amidst the ruins. As autumn faded and winter began to tighten its icy grip, a new and fearsome element entered the fray. General Winter, the German army, overconfident that the campaign would be over before the first snow, was completely unprepared. The soldiers of the 6th Army were still in their thin summer uniforms as temperatures plummeted to -20, -30, even -40 degrees Celsius. Lubricants in guns and tank engines froze solid. Vehicles wouldn't start. Soldiers suffered from frostbite, their fingers and toes turning black with necrosis. The relentless cold, combined with malnutrition and constant nervous strain, sapped the German forces of both their physical and mental strength. In contrast, the Soviet troops, while also suffering from the bitter cold, were accustomed to it. They were better equipped with quilted winter jackets, fur hats, and felt boots. They knew how to stay warm, how to operate their weapons in freezing conditions. The Russian winter did not win the battle on its own, but it crippled their enemy. It magnified every mistake, every weakness in the German logistical system, and turned the life of every German soldier in the pocket into a frozen hell. The gray sky, the white, snow-covered ground, and the howling winds seemed to be allies of the city's defenders. While soldiers fought and died in the cold, the human cost of this battle was not limited to them. Hundreds of thousands of civilians remained trapped in the city. Stalin's not a step back order applied to them as well. They endured the ceaseless bombing, lived in damp cellars, and faced starvation as supplies ran out. They dug trenches, worked in arms factories until they were destroyed, and cared for the wounded. The personal stories of survival and loss are heartbreaking. Mothers who lost their children to shelling, orphan children wandering the ruins, families torn apart forever. This was total war, where the line between the front and the home front had ceased to exist. For the soldiers on both sides, Stalingrad was a dehumanizing experience. Letters and diaries recovered later paint a horrifying picture of despair. One German soldier wrote to his family, "We are in a cauldron. I only hope that God will not forsake us and will give me the strength to endure what is to come." Another wrote, "All around is nothing but death. It is no longer war. It is a slaughterhouse." The brutality of the fighting eroded all notions of glory or heroism. It was reduced to primitive survival, a daily struggle against shells, starvation, disease, and madness. As the Germans became bogged down and exhausted in the city's ruins, the Soviet High Command, under the direction of brilliant generals like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, was quietly preparing a thunderous counterstroke. They had identified a fatal weakness in the German deployment. To concentrate the elite forces of the Sixth Army on crushing Stalingrad itself, the Germans had relied on their weaker allies, the Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian armies, who were poorly equipped and had low morale to guard the long, exposed flanks. This was where the Soviets decided to strike. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus was launched. 1,000 Soviet cannons opened fire in unison, tearing apart the winter sky. Following this barrage, over 1 million soldiers and hundreds of T-34 tanks surged across the thinly held Romanian positions to the northwest and southwest of Stalingrad. The Axis lines collapsed almost instantly. Two massive Soviet pincers raced forward in a lightning offensive of their own, reversing the roles of the German blitzkrieg. Just 4 days later, on November 23rd, the lead units of the two Soviet spearheads met at the town of Kalakondan, west of Stalingrad. The trap had sprung. The entire German 6th Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army, a total of around 300,000 soldiers, were completely encircled. They were trapped in what the Germans would come to call their Kessel, the cauldron. General Paulus immediately recognized the peril of the situation and requested Hitler's permission to attempt a breakout to the west while there was still a chance. But from his distant headquarters, Hitler, who could not stomach any form of retreat, flatly refused. He declared Stalingrad a fortress and ordered the 6th Army to hold its ground at all costs. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, boasted that his air force could supply the trapped army via an air bridge. It was an empty promise. To survive, the 6th Army needed at least 500 tons of supplies per day. On the best days, the Luftwaffe could only manage a fraction of that, and often much less, to bad weather and intense Soviet anti-aircraft fire. The fate of the 6th Army was sealed. Trapped in the frozen cauldron, with no supplies and no hope of rescue, they began to slowly die. Rations ran out, and soldiers were reduced to eating their horses, then dogs, cats, and rats. Ammunition was scarce. Medical supplies were non-existent. Thousands died from starvation, disease, and the bitter cold. The situation became utterly hopeless. When the Soviets offered terms of surrender, they were rejected on Hitler's orders. The slaughter continued. Finally, at the end of January 1943, German resistance collapsed. The cauldron was split into two smaller pockets, and on January 31st, General Paulus, whom Hitler had just promoted to field marshal on the assumption that he would commit suicide rather than surrender, was captured alive in the basement of a department store. A few days later, the last remaining German soldiers laid down their arms. Of the nearly 300,000 men who had been encircled, only about 91,000 were left to surrender. And of these, after death marches to prison camps and years of hard labor, only about 5,000 would ever see Germany again. Silence finally fell over the ruined city. The Battle of Stalingrad was over, but its meaning was just beginning to reverberate around the world. Stalingrad was more than a victory. It was a symbolic and strategic turning point of immense proportions, perhaps the most significant of the entire Second World War. It shattered the myth of the German army's invincibility. For the first time, a mighty German field army had not just been defeated, but utterly annihilated. The loss in manpower and materiel for the Third Reich was irreplaceable. Hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers were lost, along with vast quantities of tanks, artillery, and aircraft. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. They could only react, retreat, and delay the inevitable. For the Soviet Union, the victory was an enormous moral boost. It proved that the enemy could be beaten. It galvanized patriotism and the will to resist across the nation. Stalingrad became a rallying cry, a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. As one journalist wrote, it was the place where fascism broke its teeth. The legacy of Stalingrad is complex and multifaceted. It is a lesson in the dangers of allowing ideology and personal hubris to override military reason. It demonstrated the vital importance of logistics in modern warfare. It reshaped military thinking, revealing the brutal and unpredictable nature of urban combat. But above all, the legacy of Stalingrad is a profound reminder of the human cost of war. This battle was like a giant, macabre chess game played out in a vast slaughterhouse, where every move was paid for in blood and bone, where there was no retreat, and where survival was a matter of pure chance. Over 2 million lives were extinguished, a thriving city was wiped off the map, and psychological wounds were seared into the memories of generations. When we look back at the ashes of Stalingrad, we see not just a battle. We see the pinnacle of the brutality man can inflict upon man, but also the extraordinary human capacity to endure, to resist, and to sacrifice for what they believe in. And perhaps the most important lesson Stalingrad leaves us with, through the smoke of time, is an urgent call to cherish peace, and to do everything possible to ensure that such a hell on earth is never, ever repeated.